The history of Scotland explores the proud nation of Scotland. Despite being part of the modern United Kingdom, of which it is the second largest in terms of land and population, Scotland was, up until the early 17th century, a fully separate and independent nation. This was a direct result of centuries of struggle, warfare, and adaptation, shaped by alliances, betrayals, and perhaps most importantly, the enduring spirit of its people, who were determined to shape their own destiny for themselves. But how did this nation coalesce from a group of Celtic tribes into becoming one of the most patriotic and culturally recognizable countries on the planet today? This is the history of Scotland. Just to let you know that some of the historic maps featured in our videos are now available for purchase through our online map store. Whether you're a history enthusiast, a collector, or simply love the artistry of old maps, you'll find a curated selection of stunning prints to explore. The land that would one day become the nation of Scotland has been inhabited by humans for well over 11,000 years. Although little is known about these early people, as they left no written records, they lived much like their counterparts across Europe at the time. First as nomadic hunter-gatherers, before gradually settling down into permanent communities with the advent of farming around 7,000 years ago. Some of these early settlements saw the construction of megalithic standing stone circles, such as those at Stennis in Orkney and Callanish on the Isle of Lewis, which served as sites of religious and ritual practice. The first written account of Scotland did not come from its native inhabitants, but from Pytheas of Massalia, a geographer who, around 326 BC, possibly circumnavigated around the entirety of Britain. He named the whole island Albion, but referred to the northernmost part as Orcus, a name that later influenced the designation of the Orkney Islands. In the following centuries, this geographical knowledge of the British Isles passed into the hands of the Romans, who launched their invasion of Britain from across the Channel in 44 AD. Although they initially conquered the southern portion of the island, they gradually pushed northwards in the subsequent decades and by 72 AD had entered what is now southern Scotland. The Romans probed further into Scotland during the 80s AD as part of an effort by the new governor of Britannia, Gnaeus Julius Agricola, to bring the entire island under Roman rule. Many of the native tribes had already submitted to Roman authority by this point, but the Caledonians, led by their chieftain Calgacus, continued to offer resistance. Determined to subdue the last unconquered tribe of Britannia, Agricola led his legions into northeastern Scotland and decisively defeated the Caledonians at the Battle of Mons Graupius in 84 AD. In the battle's aftermath, the Romans constructed a series of forts and watchtowers in an attempt to consolidate their hold over the region. However, within just a few years, many of these fortifications were abandoned as the Romans withdrew their forces further south. This was likely due to a combination of factors, including the economic and military costs of administering a rugged and relatively undeveloped land, which was inhabited by a warlike people who continued to resist Roman rule. By 87 AD, the Roman occupation was largely limited to the southern uplands, and by the end of the 1st century, their northernmost boundary had been drawn on a line between the River Tyne and the Solway Firth. This frontier was later marked by the construction of Hadrian's Wall, which began in 134 AD. Despite withdrawing from Scotland, the Romans remained determined not to concede defeat and continued launching military expeditions beyond the wall. Around 140 AD, they briefly reoccupied southern Scotland, constructing a new line of fortifications between the Firth of Forth and the Firth of Clyde, known as the Antonine Wall. However, this too was abandoned shortly after 161 AD, and the Romans retreated once again. Although further campaigns were conducted in Scotland over the following centuries, Rome's northernmost frontier remained fixed at Hadrian's Wall for the remainder of the empire's existence in Britannia. The intermittent Roman presence in Scotland coincided with the emergence of the Picts, a confederation of Celtic tribes living north of the Forth and Clyde, who may have been the descendants of the Caledonians. By the late 4th century, however, Rome's grip on northern Britannia was weakening, and several barbarian groups began launching incursions into Roman-held territory. The Picts attacked Hadrian's Wall from the north, the Germanic Saxons raided westwards from across the North Sea, and similarly, seafarers from Ireland carried out raids along the western coast. It was this latter group, known as the Scotti, who would leave the longest-lasting impression on the region and give rise to the nation that would ultimately bear their name, Scotia or Scotland. Following the Romans' withdrawal from Britain in 411 AD, these differing barbarian tribes carved out their own respective and distinct kingdoms across the region. The Picts, who spoke a variety of the Old Celtic language, formed the kingdom of Fortriu in the northeast. The Anglo-Saxons, who spoke a form of Old English, established the kingdom of Bernicia, which would later become the kingdom of Northumbria in the southeast. The Brythonic, Celtic-speaking peoples of the kingdom of Strathclyde settled in the southwest, while the Gaelic-speaking Scotti formed the kingdom of Dalriata in the west, which also extended into parts of what is now Northern Ireland. During this period, the British Isles were undergoing a profound religious transformation. In 564 AD, the Irish monk Saint Columba led a mission across the sea, establishing the monastery of Iona on a remote island off the western coast of Scotland. This monastic community became the spiritual heart of a movement that over the next century saw the gradual conversion of the Gaels, Picts, and Saxons from their ancestral pagan beliefs to Christianity. Although these kingdoms shared a common faith, they retained their political differences, which resulted in centuries of almost incessant warfare, as one kingdom temporarily gained ascendancy over the others. This fragile balance of power, however, was disrupted in 794 AD, when a new group of raiders arrived on Scotland's shores. The Viking Age began with ferocious raids on the isolated Christian monasteries, notably those at Iona and Lindisfarne. These initial attacks increased in number and intensity over the following years, before giving way to permanent Norse colonies being established in Shetland and the Western Isles by the early 9th century, with the latter forming the mixed Norse-Gaelic kingdom of the Isles by 850 AD. The Viking incursions prompted the Gaelic kingdom of Dalriata to merge with the Pictish kingdom of Fortriu in the 840s, under the leadership of Kenneth. Over time, MacAlpin's successors established the kingdom of Alba in the early 11th century, laying the foundations for the emergence of the Kingdom of Scotland. By the end of the 12th century, this kingdom had absorbed the territory of Strathclyde, as well as parts of Northumbria, forming a border with the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to the south, which had by this point united to form the Kingdom of England. The 12th century was a pivotal era in Scotland's history, witnessing the rise of the Dunkeld dynasty, which would come to rule the kingdom for the following 200 years. However, it was also during this time that an increasing degree of foreign influence began to be felt in Scotland's politics. After consolidating his control over England in 1066, William the Conqueror marched north to force King Malcolm III to submit to his authority. Some Norman knights entered the service of the Scottish royal court and introduced a new influence, which resulted in the adoption of Norman feudal practices, which thereafter irreversibly linked Scotland with the power dynamics of its southern neighbor. Scotland was, however, not solely being influenced by England during this time. The Western Isles remained under the control of the descendants of the early Norse colonizers and were officially recognized as part of the Kingdom of Norway in the year 1098. By the 13th century, Scotland had begun pressuring Norway to relinquish its hold on these territories. Although it would take fighting an inconclusive battle at Largs in 1264 before King Alexander successfully negotiated the annexation of the islands, as well as the Isle of Man, through signing the Treaty of Perth in 1267. Despite this territorial consolidation, Alexander's untimely death 21 years later, in 1286, plunged Scotland into a succession crisis. The clan system, which had emerged during the 12th century, contributed to the instability, as no fewer than 14 claimants vied for the throne. The Scottish nobles therefore sought the mediation of King Edward I of England to settle the dispute. However, he used the opportunity to extract legal recognition of Scotland being a feudal dependency of the English crown before choosing John Balliol as its new king in 1292. Edward further exploited the concessions he had gained to undermine Scotland's monarchy and independence in the following years. In response, Scotland entered into an alliance with France, hoping that it would offer protection from any further English aggression. These hopes were nevertheless soon dashed. In 1296, Edward I invaded Scotland to take the kingdom for himself. One of the most symbolic acts of his conquest was the removal of the Stone of Scone, the sacred coronation stone of Scottish monarchs, to Westminster Abbey in London. There, Edward had it incorporated into his coronation chair as a declaration of his authority as Lord Paramount of Scotland. The stone was subsequently used in the coronation of all English and later British monarchs. In response to the English occupation, a group of Scottish nobles, led by William Wallace, raised an army and began the series of conflicts known to history as the Wars of Scottish Independence. Wallace won a notable victory at the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297, but was defeated by King Edward I in the following year at the Battle of Falkirk. Forced into hiding, Wallace was eventually captured in 1305, taken to London, and summarily executed as a traitor, despite never having sworn loyalty to Edward. Following Wallace's death, Robert the Bruce was crowned as the King of Scotland in 1306 and continued the struggle against English rule. His decisive victory at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314 secured Scotland's de facto independence and helped bring an end to the first phase of the conflict by 1328. However, war erupted again in 1332 as part of yet another succession crisis for the Scottish crown. The conflict only concluded in 1357 with the Treaty of Berwick, following the release of King David II, Robert the Bruce's son, from captivity in London after he had been captured at the Battle of Neville's Cross in 1346. With its independence firmly established, Scotland, under David II's successor, Robert II, entered into a new era in 1371 with the establishment of the Stuart dynasty, a royal lineage that would dominate Scottish and later British history for the next 300 years. The dawning of the 15th century saw Scotland emerge geographically as the nation we recognize today. Although it lost control of the Isle of Man in the early 1400s, in 1468, it acquired its last significant territorial expansion when King James III received the Orkney and Shetland Islands as part of his marriage to Margaret of Denmark. The city of Edinburgh too gained significance, as it formally became the nation's capital in 1437, replacing the historic role that Scone had played as the site of the coronations. Many of Scotland's major educational institutions were also founded during this time, including the University of St. Andrews in 1413, the University of Glasgow in 1451, and the University of Aberdeen in 1495. By the early 16th century, however, Scotland once again found itself embroiled in a war with England. In 1513, King James IV invaded his southern neighbor, only to suffer a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Flodden Field. The Scottish army was decimated, and James IV himself was killed, becoming the last British monarch to die in battle. His son and successor, James V, fared little better, suffering a crushing defeat at the Battle of Solway Moss in 1542. These conflicts were closely tied to the religious upheavals sweeping across Europe at the time as part of the Protestant Reformation. In 1534, King Henry VIII of England broke with the Catholic Church to establish his own Church of England. Determined to weaken the historic old alliance between Catholic Scotland and Catholic France, Henry launched a brutal campaign known as the Rough Wooing in an attempt to bring Scotland onto his side and force a marriage between his son, Prince Edward, and the young Scottish Queen Mary. Although the war ended in 1551, Queen Mary was sent to France, where she married the heir to the French throne, Francis II, in 1558. Their union was short-lived as Francis died in 1560 and Mary returned to Scotland, only to find her homeland had severed ties with France and formally embraced Protestantism. Mary's reign as queen was plagued by political turmoil. Though she remained a Catholic, she did not attempt to overturn the Protestant Reformation, an approach that satisfied neither her Catholic supporters nor her Protestant rivals. Amid conspiracies and rebellions, she was ultimately forced to abdicate in 1567 in favor of her infant son, James VI. A civil war quickly followed, with factions loyal to the young king battling those who still supported his mother. When later seeking refuge in England, Mary found herself imprisoned by her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I, who eventually had her executed for treason. Despite his mother's fate, James VI of Scotland inherited the English throne upon Elizabeth's death in 1603, thereby becoming the king of both nations through the union of the crowns. While this was a dynastic and personal union, Scotland and England remained as two separate kingdoms, each with its own government and legal system. However, James moved his royal court to London, and from that point forward, Scotland's monarchy would be based in the English capital. The political distance between Scotland and its monarchy also widened in the subsequent years under James's son, Charles I, who ascended the throne in 1625. His attempt to impose an English-style prayer book in Scotland in 1637 provoked widespread unrest, particularly among the Presbyterian Scottish Covenanters. When Charles sought to suppress this opposition, he inadvertently